Good morning, High Rock family. Pastor Kristian Hernandez here. It's such a joy to be able to share God's Word with you this morning, to join in this incredible Lenten series. I want to begin by sharing a story that left a profound impression on me. I was talking to a gentleman many years ago who was a plumber by trade, but over the years he kind of grew in his industry and he ended up getting a very high-ranking position for the city of New York. I'm going to leave the details murky after this because I don't want to incriminate anybody. I'm here to preach God's Word, not trying to get anybody arrested. Long story short, he shared how he went into an official kind of government space that was in charge of delivering water to New York City, and he was flabbergasted. He found pipes that were critical to delivering water to New York City. Some of these pipes actually had chlorine, a very dangerous chemical. And one of the pipes actually was being fastened to the ceiling by none other than a belt. That's right, you heard it. A leather belt that's used to keep trousers up, not designed to keep very heavy pipes fastened to the ceiling, some of which have caustic gases in them. So he was just dumbfounded. Thankfully, he was the right man for the job. He fixed everything. It's a functioning system at this point, and that's why I proudly drink New York's tap water. But the story left an impression on me because detail after detail, as he shared, he described a scene that people had just become accustomed to coexisting with a broken system. It wasn't functional. It wasn't safe. Yet they were walking in and out of that place every single day. It was existing in the backdrop while New Yorkers were opening up their tap water and enjoying a glass of water. In the backdrop, there was this potential disaster that at any given moment, that leather belt could just snap, and all of a sudden, we're in serious problems. I think of that story when I think of the text of Scripture that we read today, because I think this woman that we're learning about as Jesus meets her at the well, she's a prime example of how comfortable we can become with a broken system. You see, this woman had faced some unspeakable shame in her lifetime. She was part of a people group that had been really denigrated, and slurs were invented by the Jewish people toward them. If you're not familiar with some of the context, maybe I think it was about 20 some odd years before this moment when Jesus meets her, some of her own people had scattered human bones on the temple. And this was a huge disgrace to the Jewish people. And so they made the Samaritans pay. So much so that when we read in the text earlier on, and you read the whole passage, she recoils when Jesus comes to her and asks her to give him a drink because she says, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And so she's part of a people group that have been segregated, that have been just treated poorly. The slur that was invented against them was they called them dogs. Imagine being on the receiving end, and for some of us that's not a wild imagination. We have been on the receiving end of people hurling slurs at us or saying derogatory things or demeaning things. This woman, this is her whole lifetime. And in addition to that, we read in the text that she actually also had a really unfortunate series of heartbreak. We read that when Jesus is engaging with her and he asks her for a drink, he tells her to bring her husband. And we discover at that moment that she had not had one husband, she had 5. And that actually the present relationship she was in, she wasn't married. And so at first glance, from our vantage point, it's very easy to misread this moment and think that she's just unfaithful and can't she keep a relationship together? Why does she keep picking the wrong people? But unfortunately, in that time, in that context, women didn't have the power to get a divorce. So she was a victim of being divorced upon 5 times. 5 times her name has changed. 5 times her security, her sense of family has changed over her short lifetime. People didn't live back then as long as they live now. She's had a whole life packed into a short amount of time that has been riddled with shame and being ostracized. Her personal story is really broken. And yet we read that she is drawing water at a time of day that no one should ever draw water. Ideally, in that kind of heat, in that region of the world, one would get up very early, before the sun rises, to draw water, because to do so in the middle of the day, as she did, would be torturous. It's a long process to draw water to sustain one's livestock, and to do that in the blistering Arabian heat, so to speak, the Middle East, the sun bearing down on you in a desert area. This is not a great decision, but it is a great decision if you're trying to avoid people. If you're trying to just keep distance from people that have mistreated you, that have looked down upon you, if you're trying to intentionally isolate, then going in the middle of the day makes total sense. And so what is she doing? In essence, she's just trying to manage and live and exist within a very broken life. This isn't functional. This isn't ideal, and it isn't working. And it's taking extra energy and extra steps on her part in order to manage and make this life of hers work. But we have to admit, it's a very broken existence. Arguably, she's probably quite exhausted with her life. But very similar to this woman, I think we can relate and admit, if we're honest, that we also become comfortable with broken systems. Broken systems that cause us to isolate from others, very similar to her. And like her, the amount of energy that it takes to exist within the broken systems of our life, it's a lot. It's exhausting. You see, it takes a lot of energy to isolate from others. Actually, it takes more energy to isolate than it does to engage. It's a different kind of energy to engage when it's challenging to engage. But it takes a lot of energy to avoid, to have to think 10 steps ahead, just so that you can insulate yourself. And this woman is going through it. And what we're looking at, an image of someone who is essentially just managing exhaustion, trying to do their best to manage the exhaustion of life. And I think we could very much relate to that scenario. Not just as a result of the last 2 years, but I think even before the pandemic, we just weren't as hyper aware of it because we were busy, we were distracted. There was lots of things to numb ourselves with. But we have probably been managing exhaustion, many of us, for many, many years. And it's all now just catching up with us. I want to pause right now and invite you just to slow down and reflect on your life and consider the following. What are the broken systems in your life? What are the things that are not working? And rather than admit that they're not working, you're spending a lot of energy working around them. They're kind of like that belt that's holding up the pipe. It's not long term. It's not sustainable. What is not working? What are the broken systems in your life? What's simply not working and is becoming exhausting to bear with? Just take a moment, reflect on that, name that, and then let's come back together. Welcome back. As we continue to engage in this text, we discover that this woman that's in the midst of managing the exhaustion of her life, trying to find some functionality within a broken system of life, we discover that Jesus fully meets her in this space. And it's an amazing passage when we look at how this woman has this encounter with Jesus. We read that Jesus asked her for a drink. But in this request, what he ultimately does, he reveals not how thirsty he was, but he actually ends up revealing how thirsty she was. How dry her life was. How unsustainable her attempts to cope with the strains of life. When he asked her for this drink, he's asking her for so much more. You see, because this cup that she is drawing water from, in order for Jesus to actually receive a drink from her, he's going to have to put his lips on the same vessel that she puts her lips on the same vessel that has her there at noon, isolating herself. In some ways, this cup is very symbolic of the brokenness of her life because it represents her isolation. It represents the shame that she carries. There she is. She's trying to quench physical thirst in a life that's dying and exhausted and dehydrated from love, affection, relationships. And at this moment, when Jesus is asking her to give her a drink, what he's really asking her is, would you come out of hiding? Would you admit to me? Would you bring me a drink? And in doing so, would you admit that your life isn't working? That isolating is exhausting? That the shame you're carrying is too much? In order for him to take this drink, he's going to have to become so up close and personal with her brokenness, with her shame. In fact, he's speaking to her in public. That already was a taboo at that time. It was actually written in many of the codes at that time that men should not be seen talking to women in public, not even their wives. And so Jesus is doing what Jesus does, this boundary crossing love. He's encountering her regardless of the stigma that may be labeled upon him. He doesn't care what people might say. In fact, he made it his intention to go this route to make sure that he could meet with this woman at the well. He's very intent on encountering this woman and asking her to give him a drink at this moment so that she could actually come out of hiding. So that the pain that she's carrying could actually be relieved. See, this moment is so poetic because he's asking her to give him a drink of water from the same well that she's drawing from. And he'll have to drink from the cup that she's drinking from. And this cup, it speaks of her isolation. It speaks of her abandonment, her powerlessness, even of the racism that her people have experienced. And in this moment, when he's asking for a drink of water, he's asking for so much more of her. Because when he says, give me something to drink, what he's really asking her is, give me your pain. Let me taste your loneliness. Give me your exhaustion. Admit this isn't working. By giving me this drink, it's the first time you're letting someone close to you in a long time, even someone that you think shouldn't be close to you because of the tensions between Jews and Samaritans. I think of this moment and I reflect back to our lives and I wonder if we might find the same courage that this woman found to admit that our lives aren't working, that there's areas of our life that are just not functioning. We're working around them, but they're broken. And it's exhausting to live and carry with these relationships, with these work situations, these financial pressures, these addictions, all of these broken things that we're not fully facing, we're living with them. Yet Jesus is saying, give me them. Bring them to me. I wonder if in the midst of this season of reckoning on so many levels, could we come face to face and admit that the Band-Aids we've been applying to our lives have not worked? Could we admit that vacations alone aren't resetting us, that drinking away our stress isn't helping, that drowning ourselves with news and information or overworking or these things that we try to run to and cling to in order to make our lives functional aren't working? We're still living within these broken systems that are hanging around our lives. You know, we often think in America that more money could help. And yeah, at times more money relieves some slight pressure, but if we're honest and we look around, we will be forced to acknowledge very quickly and thoroughly that the presence of more money doesn't really help profoundly, or it doesn't really get to the root of things. Because if it did, then places like Hollywood, Wall Street, Silicon Valley would be places of incredible, thorough human flourishing, but they're filled with just as much brokenness as anywhere else. Jesus is saying to this woman, and he's saying to us, if you and I would still our hearts to listen, as he says to her, give me a drink. And he's asking for so much more than just water. He's asking her, bring me your pain, bring me your isolation, bring me the broken things in your life. He's inviting us to do the same, saying, give me your thoughts, your memories, your feelings. Would you give me your relationships? Relationship with your mom, your dad, with your siblings, your extended family. Would you bring me your singleness? Will you bring me your career? Would you bring me all the things that represent to you those broken places in your life, the systems that aren't working? Would you bring them to him? See, admitting that our lives aren't working in these key areas, this isn't an act of defeat. It's actually the first step towards freedom. Jesus is speaking to us, High Rock, and he's saying, give me. If you hear nothing else from this sermon, would you hear the voice of Jesus from this text speaking directly to you? Give me your company. Give me your relationships. Give me your possessions. Give me the things that are weighing down. Give me whatever that thing is. It's up to you to discern with Jesus how you fill in that blank. But let's be clear that Jesus in love is coming to us, and he's refusing to let us live with these broken things without offering us freedom. But the freedom first comes, the first step in that freedom is to say yes to his invitation to give him the pain, the isolation, the history that we're carrying. I want to pause there for a moment and just invite you to just name what God might be doing in your heart right now. Quite simply, the question I pose to you is, what is God inviting you to give him? What is God inviting you to give him? Would you just take a moment now, jot it down, and just sit with it for a moment and think about what Jesus is saying to you, and imagine what it might look like to give this to Jesus, to no longer carry it yourself, but to actually surrender it into his hands. Let's just take a moment and jot that down, name it, and then we'll come back and continue. Welcome back. You see, but Jesus doesn't just invite this woman to give him a drink and by extension bring to him all the things that are associated with this well and this cup and her life, the layers of brokenness that she's living with. He also says that she should ask him. He invites her to ask him for living water. You know, I really reflected on those two things that Jesus was offering to this woman and began to consider what it might look like for us to respond to this invitation of give me a drink, give me the pain, the shame, the things that you're carrying, but also in addition, ask me for living water. And what I've come to reflect on is that I think often our struggle is that we ask Jesus for living water without first giving him the things that we're carrying that are broken. See, with many of my friends that don't follow Jesus, and as I hang out with them and talk with them, I've come to, and maybe you can relate with this on some level if you're not a follower of Jesus. At a certain level, I think when they've admitted to me that ultimately they want to find Jesus useful. They want to find a use for Jesus without also finding him beautiful. And so they want Jesus to function for them. They want Jesus to relieve issues in their life, to be a great coach to them and help them through some issues without ever actually finding him to be beautiful. And maybe you could relate, even as a follower of Jesus. We often come to Jesus and say, give me living water. We ask him for that living water, asking him for relief, asking him for freedom, without first giving him the things that are burdening us. And so we want Jesus to be useful for us. Make my life better, make it more comfortable, relieve me of these stresses and these issues. But that won't happen unless we're on this two-way street of giving to Jesus what we're carrying and asking him to give us living water. In my experience, we really only see the beauty of Jesus when we let him see our ugliness. In other words, we only really get to taste the living waters when we reveal to Jesus the cup of our loneliness and shame and our brokenness. Because it's in that moment that we see the true beauty of Jesus, that he's willing to embrace us, to meet us even in that space. What has to change for many of us is that we have to go from saying to God, help me, but I don't want to share what's broken in me, to God, here's what's broken in me. You're asking me to give it to you. I'm giving it to you. But also help me. I'm asking you for living water. See, when we're asking Jesus to fill us with his living water, what we're really doing is we're asking the Holy Spirit to fill us in our broken spaces. See, the living water, it's described as this spring. Jesus said it would spring up. And this interesting fact from this water management website, it says that springs occur when water pressure causes a natural flow of groundwater onto the Earth's surface. See, so what happens is that as rainwater enters into an area, pressure is placed on the water already present, and then this pressure moves water through the cracks and tunnels so that the water finally flows out naturally to the surface at places called springs. It's a beautiful image that Jesus is painting for us, because he's painting for us this image that when Jesus' life fills us and keeps filling us, when we keep asking him to give us living water, what happens is his life works its way up through the cracks of our life. It works its way up and eventually out of us when we ask him to fill us with living water. And what's uncomfortable but so essential for healing is that the living water going through those cracks inside of us and coming out of us, it's going to pass through some wounds and some hurting parts in our life. The cracks in our life. Like this woman. But altogether, the water from those cracks and tunnels, as they flow out of us, they make you and I a conduit of God's love. In this season, we are in desperate need for living water. We don't need a new philosophy, a new self-help book. We don't need some of the things that we keep running to solely. What we really need, what Jesus alone could offer, no one else has offered in history, what Jesus is offering at this moment. Living water. Water from his Spirit that will go through the cracks and crevices of our lives, that will interact with the pain and the wounds of our life and flow out of us, supernaturally empowering us to not live the way we would tend to live, but to actually live from a place of grace and power and love that doesn't come from us. That Jesus would live in us and also flow through us through these living waters that he promises those who not only give him the cup of our pain and shame, but ask him for living water. You know, in my life, one of the cracks and crevices and painful parts has been learning to be a parent to my sons. I didn't grow up with a dad, and so how to parent a boy is kind of like a puzzle for me. It's like a blank slate, and I don't always know what to do. And what I discovered in those moments over the years is that, unbeknownst to me, under the surface, there was a lot of anxiety that was in my soul when I would just interact with my first son, my 10-year-old now. Why? Because he has grown up so different than me. He's not seen anything compared to what I saw growing up. So as a result, he's incredibly carefree. He is kind in a way that I was not naturally kind. He's just a free spirit and just like a really nice kid. I'm not just saying that because he's my kid. He's just like, this is a nice kid. And I'll be honest, that freaks me out. You'd say, why does that freak you out? Because in my experience, people that aren't guarded and ready to fight and just like always, you're vulnerable, you're prey. And so even though the neighborhood we grow up in, that he's grown up in, is nothing like the one I grew up in, and he doesn't have to worry about the things I worried about, I worry about them. It's taken some time with a therapist and much prayer, lots of patient conversations with my wife, her extending patience toward me, realizing that this was a crack in my soul. And that I was engaging with my son on a level of anxiety that wasn't helpful. And so what I began to do when I became aware of it is every time I would go and engage and be with him, and he would do things and say things that a 10-year-old should say. A 10-year-old that doesn't have the history that I have should be able to say. I would realize you're getting anxious, Chris. You want to right now react and tell him to toughen up or to be different. And at those moments, I would begin to pray. I've been learning to pray in those moments, and I continue to do so, and ask Jesus for living water to fill me, that my anxieties would subside, that I would be at a place of peace and joy and centered in Jesus. And can I tell you, it's still a work in progress. But since I began to give Jesus these things that I was carrying and ask him to fill me with his life, I have found that I've been able to enjoy my son and actually appreciate how he is, and hasn't stressed me to think that he has to toughen up or change or become more like me when I was a kid, because that's what my mind would think would keep him safe. No, it's been liberating to continue to come to Jesus in that space and say, Lord, here is what I'm carrying, and would you fill me now with your presence? I wonder for you, when you identify the cracks in your life, the places that you're carrying some unhealthy things, some really heavy things, what would it look like for you to recognize those things, to name them, to give them to Jesus, and then to actively pray, Lord, fill me with your living water? Imagine anxiety no longer taking over in those vulnerable spaces. Imagine there being peace where there presently is fear. Imagine you finding the grace to deal with difficult people and situations that you don't have within yourself, but Jesus begins to supernaturally provide it. That's what's available to us as we ask for living water. High Rock, I want to encourage you with all the fiber of my being. Let's be a people that in the broken places, not only of our lives, but in the broken places in our world and in our city, could we go into those spaces and ask Jesus for living water to fill? Our world is thirsty. We're thirsty. Let's ask him for living water that only he can provide, that we desperately need.